Delighted to have our next speaker with us today. Professor Elliott Colla is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown. He's the author of Conflicted Antiquities, Egyptology, Egyptomania, and Egyptian Modernity, a project that involved extensive work locating and translating Arabic sources that had been previously overlooked or ignored. In fact, he is a translator of many works of contemporary Arabic literature, including works by Ibrahim Aslan's novel The Heron, Idris Ali's Poor, Ibrahim Al-Koni's Gold Dust, as well as works by Yahya Tahir Abdullah, Ghada Abdel Menem, and many others. He's currently translating The Enemists, Al-Koni's Epic of the Sahara. Al-Koni is a very important Libyan author, and is working on a study titled 1001 Readings in the Arabian Nights. Dr. Colla will be speaking on the culture of revolt. Welcome, a warm welcome to you.
I hope this will be loud enough. Thanks very much for coming out today. And I just want to begin by adding a disclaimer, which is that the uprisings that we see throughout the Arab world right now are not rooted in culture. In other words, in many ways, culture is not the explaining feature of them. It's you could read novels, you could read poems, and never come to the conclusion that these are societies in revolt. But at the same time, what we would call expressive culture, more broadly, that's poetry, song, especially, I'll talk a little bit about the difference between them and novels and so on. That expressive culture has been playing a major role and will continue to play a major role in the revolutions that we're watching. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, just to give you some images and some words of what is being said on the Arab streets. Just to begin, I'm going to really focus on Egypt, and if afterwards, if there are any questions about other places, I'd be happy to answer them, but Egypt is really the place I know a little bit about, and I'm going to start there. This, of course, is an image from Tahrir Square. If you were watching Aljazeera or even CNN, you now know what Tahrir Square is. And a lot of what I'm going to be showing you today is just taken from YouTube videos and recordings and interviews with people who've been there. Before I begin with the culture, let me just give you a brief sketch or introduction to revolution in Egypt. Egyptians have revolted about 10 times by my count since 1881. That's pretty good. This is not a passive society. This is a society in movement, a society very articulate about its demands, and has a very long history of being at the forefront of demanding progressive democratic change in the Arab world and on the African continent. In 1881, this first, I'll give you a couple highlights, the Arabi Revolt. This actually was a revolt of an emerging middle class of Egyptians, many of whom were in trade or in education or even in the military and in different professions like engineering. They managed to overthrow a very corrupt king or khedive at the time and install what was Africa's second parliament. It was very short-lived because the imperial powers of the time did not appreciate this, and it was crushed in 1882 with a British invasion that instituted 70 years of direct military rule. But what's interesting about that, if we start the clock in 1881, one of the leaders of the 1881 revolution was a man named Mahmoud Sami al-Baroudi, who was the major neoclassical poet of his time. He was also one of the first parliamentarians. So this brings into to play some things that will be, some themes that have been there throughout this history. Starting in 1881, why would one of the leaders of that first revolution be a poet? And why would that poet become a statesman, right? This is true. Each of these revolutions, I could go through and give you names of poets, names of singers, who are also politicians in their own right, for each one of these, okay? And there's a reason why. So each of these revolutions have had their own poets, their artists, their writers, giving expression to the people's demands and their needs and their aspirations, focusing and refining and leading the manufacture of ideas. So throughout this history, what we would call expressive culture, that's poetry, writing, intellectual life, and so on, has always been playing a leading role. Now, in times of political repression, or in conditions of political repression, we always find this. This is not specific to Egypt. In other words, if you are denied avenues of self-representation in the political realm, you're going to figure out other ways to represent yourself in other realms. And that's where literature has come into play so often, because it's another platform from which to speak. And so I'm going to, each of these revolutions I could go through and give you a few poets and a few singers and so on. And in fact, I'll leave that, if you're interested, I'll leave that for later. What I want to say is that if we want to characterize this culture, I would call it largely do-it-yourself. But it's not amateur. As I hope to show you today, there's a lot of talent and skill and professionalism going into this. But it is do-it-yourself in the sense that it's emerging from the streets, it's on the spot, it's spontaneous, and it doesn't cost a lot of money to do. So what I'm going to go through right now is just different kinds of popular culture that were emerging in those weeks between January 25th and February 11th. Some of this spread by word of mouth. Some of it spread in the demonstrations. A lot of it, in fact, just emerging out of demonstrations. Some of it is private. Some of it is what people tell each other in private. Some of it is what they tell each other in public. A lot of this stuff has been circulating in email and on social media and places like Facebook and elsewhere. A lot of this has been self-published. We saw on Tahrir Square a resurgence of manifesto publishing, all sorts of groups publishing fascinating material right there on the spot, giving their analysis and attempting to provide leadership. Some of this has come out in videos, lots and lots of graffiti. Cairo is not a city known for its great tradition of graffiti, but for a couple weeks in January and February, it's become a pretty amazing place for graffiti and art and so on. So I'm going to start right now with cartoons and try to set the scene. One of the first things we saw was in opposition papers in the weeks right out, in fact, just in the days following the toppling of Ben Ali in Tunisia, we started seeing ideas coming forth that as Tunisia, so we might be able to do here in Egypt. And this, you see this, for instance, this is our cartoonist from a Dastour newspaper, an Egyptian opposition press, and you see there the man with the Tunisian flag handing the baton, who's next, right? Or the Tunisian there on the left doing his math, and the Egyptian, that's the Egyptian flag on the right, copying, right? And figuring out, okay, well, how do we do this? What is the calculation, right? So that's definitely one factor. The Tunisian example was new in that history of revolutions I just showed you, those 10 revolutions. What was new in this time around was there was a neighboring example of how it might be done and relatively quick. Another catalyst for this was the accident of the calendar, which was that on January 25th, it was National Police Day. Now, what is ridiculous about this, or what was potentially this year, what was explosive about that is since June of 2010, since June last year, the entire Egyptian political culture had been consumed with the story of one particular police brutality case, Khaled Said. I don't know if it's been talked about, right? Okay, so Khaled Said, you know the story. Well, so the idea of celebrating a National Police Celebration Day in this particular context became not only ironic, right, but incendiary. And this is precisely why that choice of January 25th was so smart. It's also a national holiday, which means people aren't going to work, which means they can go out on the streets. This was luck. I don't know if anyone understood where it was going to go. But here's a wonderful set of the cartoon on the left I love a lot. That appeared in that week. Another recurring example, here I'll just read it out loud. I love you, the one on the left. I love you, Susie, as much as there are raindrops in the sky, as much as there are leaves in the trees, as much as there are riot police in the streets. Another aspect of that Tunisian example was this recurrence of self-immolation. In the weeks between the fellow who set himself on fire in Tunis and January 25th, there were a number of Egyptians who set fire to themselves as well. So this cartoon, it became a phenomenon in its own right. It's been lost since January 25th, eclipsed by the events, but it's there in the memory of the cartoon. So that cartoon on the right says, regarding another self-immolation outside of Parliament. I want you to confiscate all the gas and matches in Egypt right away. Okay, it's funnier in the Arabic, I'm just going to warn you. So by the 25th, you could see this sort of consciousness even in the official newspapers of the regime. Here are two from the English weekly, El Ahram, the English weekly of the regime, El Ahram Weekly, which has its own independence, frankly. But on the right, this was Bahgouri, very much an establishment cartoonist, writing, here's a man walking into a pharmacy. He's holding a script of paper that says democracy, and the caption reads, my doctor has prescribed this for me to take. Do you carry it? Right? So this is pretty mild, but it's in the government newspaper, right? And this is just one of many that you could find. Moving to another level, so that's cartoons appearing in the print. Jokes. Samer Shehata, who was here this morning, yes, when we were undergraduates together, he wrote a great paper on political jokes in Egypt. So that was quite a number of years ago for us, but it's still true. Egyptians are amazing in their political jokes. Let me just read this one out. Once the police was going about visiting his people, he spied a farmer who slept while his water buffalo turned around, spinning the water wheel. The president got out of his car and said, "What the heck are you doing, going to sleep like that? Suppose the animal were to stop turning the wheel. Wouldn't that hurt your productivity?" The peasant answered, "Okay, Mr. President, I put a bell around her neck so that when she stops, I can hear it and get up and get her moving again." The president said, "Okay, Mr. Wise Guy, suppose the animal stopped moving, but kept nodding her head back and forth like this." In the Arabic, it's like this. And the peasant called out, "But Mr. President, not every stupid beast thinks like you." Right? And this goes back to a long-standing joke referring to Hosni Mubarak as the laughing cow, Lavash Kiri. Again, for just pure accident, he happens to look like that cow. So there's a long tradition of jokes about referring to him as a cow and as a rhinoceros, all sorts of things. It's very funny. Here's another one, just as a one-liner. This, you might hear on Johnny Carson or something. The one person currently abiding by the rules of the curfew in Egypt is Hosni Mubarak, because right, he was the only person who had disappeared for those 2 weeks. In fact, we still haven't seen him. A really great joke that I'll just say is another one. Hosni Mubarak, his wife and his son are in a helicopter. They're flying over Medina Tahrir, and people are shouting out at them. And I'm sure somebody else could tell the joke better than I. But so Gamal Mubarak, his son, says, maybe if we throw 100-pound notes out the window. Who says it? I've already ruined the joke. So the pilot says, or Mubarak says, maybe if we.
says, well, if I throw the three of you, they will all be.
So thank you, Tamim. This is why I'm a professor, not a stand-up comedian. Right, so I just want to have you think about, we'll come back to the laughter aspect, because I think that's really hasn't been studied enough, mostly because when we study laughter, we ruin it in a way, but there's something very important that happens when people are laughing at people in power. Very, very important. And I think it has to do with the way in which Egyptians stopped being afraid. And these jokes, so these are jokes circulating on the internet, word of mouth, publicly, privately. Everyone has it. If you meet it, just ask an Egyptian in the next week, oh, have you heard any good ones lately? And they'll have new ones that every couple days there's more ones coming out. Jokes are a very large part of this, right? Notice, costs nothing. All it needs is some cleverness, right? Now, there's also a lot of self-published visual art. This one on the left is really local. It reads, soldier, tyrant, time to fear your maker. It rhymes in Arabic. I'll get into that in just a bit. And on the other hand, there was a whole outpouring of international solidarity artwork being produced too. And the language is really quite different. On the left-hand side here, this is Egyptian colloquial, or it could be modern standard Arabic. It would be recognizable and perfectly legible to Arabs anywhere, but it's being produced really locally. The one on the right, of course, is designed for an English-reading audience. What does the image on the right remind anybody of?
China.
Soviet Union. Well, it's a woman, right? And it's coming out of a long tradition of left poster making. That's precisely where this is coming from. Here's a Brazilian cartoonist who, in fact, made some of the most powerful images. Notice, you don't need to know how to read to get the power of these images, right? The one on the left is the dominoes and Tunisia about to hit Mubarak's face, and the one on the right is, maybe in reference to the toppling of Saddam Hussein, or we've seen these also appearing from Libya too. The same idea of removing the idol. And here, back to Khaled Said. These are, again, from Carlos Latouf, a Brazilian artist who produced some of the most interesting cartoons. You don't need to know English to get them, but you do need to know something about local Egyptian culture. That's Khaled Said on the left. That's his caricature, right? And on the right, those are your Facebook, your social networker activists kicking Hosni Mubarak out of the country. Now, so some of this is circulating on the internet or in Xeroxes. Some of this is getting printed up and then posted back up on the street. So I want to kind of bring this cartoon back. This is Napoleon Mubarak. This is a poster on the Parliament gate from the second week of the uprising. And we'll come back to this in just a second. This is the dominant slogan of Egypt, which is Ishab Yurid Isqat al-Nizam, which we'll come back to. It means the people want or demand the end of the regime. Graffiti. So this is a graffito that says, we're all Khaled Said, right? Here's some, and I want you to pay attention to the faces of the people too, because I'll come back to that. There's a celebrational aspect to the uprising that doesn't get, that we need to pay attention to, right? That revolution is not just about anger and demands, it's also about aspirations and hopes. And this is something that there's no way to put it in words. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this from Egyptian friends and so on, that this has been a cause of major celebration. Going to the Egyptian embassy is to celebrate in the last couple of weeks after Mubarak left. It's been like a wedding with candy being handed out and dancing and singing and so on. Outside the embassy. I have no idea what it's like in the embassy right now. I think they're getting their CVs ready to apply to SFS, the School of Foreign Service here or something. So here's, I just want to go through some. So graffiti on armored on tanks. If you were watching CNN or Aljazeera, you saw it. This isn't high art, but it's remarkable. People are spray painting on tanks that are occupied by soldiers holding guns pointed at them, right? Or maybe not pointed at them, but it was unclear where they were pointed. Again, over and over again, the same symbols, the same slogans repeated, down with the regime. Here's a great image. I like this one quite a bit. And over on the left, it's hard to read. There's a group of people throwing shoes at Mubarak. This really primitive picture of Mubarak, and he's saying, "Ya ikhwan, ad-darb al-jism haram," which I translate it because it's, hey, you guys, it's not nice to throw shoes at a fellow. Maybe I'm overdoing, but it's just like wonderful that the streets were taken over and rewritten, literally rewritten, right, on all the surfaces. This is right off Tahrir Square. Okay, now I want to go back to this aspect, the way in which words were a part of it. Notice how many people are in this picture. How would you get this many people with no loudspeakers and no conductor all on the same page? How many of you are English teachers? Okay. What is the purpose of meter and rhyme? It's easy to remember, easy to learn, right? And it's easy to get everybody on the same beat. Okay? That's how you get tens of thousands of people going and shouting the same slogans over and over again. If you've been to demonstrations in this country, we're not good at it. We don't do meter, we don't do rhyme. And we waste a lot of time saying 1, 2, 3, 4, or hey ho, right? Egyptians don't waste time, and they don't waste words. So I want to get into that. First of all, let me just, all the slogans that we heard were couplets. So those of you who are English teachers or lit teachers, pay attention. Everything that was said in those mass demonstrations, you could hear blocks and blocks away, 1 million people shouting the same thing at the same time. That's because it's poetry. It's poetry. Most of it rhymed. Here's one that didn't rhyme. This was the dominant one, and I'll just read it out. Ishab yurid isqat in nizam. Right? It has a really simple message. The people want the regime to end, or the regime they want to topple the regime. It has a really simple meter: short, long, short, long, short, long, short, short, long. And a couple other things to note. This was, first of all, borrowed from Tunisia. This was, in fact, the slogan that they were shouting in Tunisia, with slightly modified here. In Tunisia, they were saying Hakuma, government. In Egypt, they were saying Nizam, regime. It's not colloquial. It's perfectly understandable to educated people, and even probably uneducated people, but it is simply not Egyptian colloquial. And that's important because it means that the audience could go beyond Egypt's borders, as it did for Tunisia. And this, of course, has since gone on to be the slogan, one of the slogans in Bahrain, and to a certain extent also in Libya, right? So these are couplets, and they travel. It's remarkable. Let me just give you say a couple words about the kinds of slogans we heard. One were all these slogans, and they've been collected all over the place, that are boasting. We don't do this so much in English poetry, but it's a very old tradition in Arabic poetry. Arabic poetry is about 1,500 years old, maybe even a little longer. So it's about 3 times what we have in English, which means, and the old stuff is really old poetry. This all rhymes. So they all rhyme. Il-halal wa ya salib dad al-atal wal-ta'zib. Right? And they're very easy to say and to get everybody on the same page very quickly. Boasting, what do I mean by boasting? These are couplets and slogans that people are chanting to get their spirits up, talk about what they're doing, and they're proud, right? Right? They're proud to be what they're doing, and that comes through when you talk to people, when you see what they're doing. That was one genre in the couplets that people were singing. Another one was invective. We don't do this so much in actually hip hop artists do boasting all the time, and they also do invective, which is putting down others, right? This, I think, to go back to the humor, was really psychologically important. The first one is Ya Mubarak, Saudiya fi intizarak. This one appeared before January 25th. It appeared as soon as Ben Ali went to Saudi Arabia, and it spread around all over the place, and it was one of the first things people were singing. In the first days of the uprising in Egypt, invective poetry was a large part. As the days wore on, it became slowly, just the same demand, that the people want the regime to end. But in the first few days, invective poetry was huge. Let me give you another one. Yeah, there's so many of these. Again, they don't sound so good in here. Ya Gamal, Ula Bouk, Kull Sha'ab Yakrahuk. Right? Hey Gamal, tell your father, all of Egypt hates you. Doesn't sound so great in Egypt. It's hilarious in Arabic. Let me show you some other ones. This one will give you a sense of how clever some of these things were. For instance, this one, there was a wonderful accident of names. Habib ElAdly was the Minister of Interior, much feared and reviled Minister of Interior, the guy overseeing torture and corruption in that ministry. And so when protesters went out in the streets, they were facing up against the state security forces, which were under the management of Habib ElAdly. Habib ElAdly's first name, Habib, happens to mean beloved, okay? Beloved, somebody who's loved, right? And there's a long tradition in Arabic poetry of talking about your beloved and writing poems to your beloved. So this provided all sorts of opportunities for very sarcastic double entendres, like Ya Habib, Hosni Mubarak, Atlu Arib. Friend, dear friend, or this Habib ElAdly. Hosni Mubarak's about to die or about to be killed. That one might sound a little macabre. Let me give you another one, this one, the third one here. Idrab ya Habib, mahma tidrab mish hansib. Okay, hit us. And to hit is also to fire, fire a gun in Egyptian colloquial, right? And so this was saying, hit us, Habib ElAdly, or hit us, dear friend, right? The more you hit us, the more we're staying. But there's an Egyptian saying that goes, Darb al-Habib zay akl zabib. The fist of the beloved, or being hit by your lover, is as sweet as raisins. Okay? So there's this, and don't ask me to explain that. You'll have to ask an Egyptian to tell you what that actually means. But in other words, there's this wonderful play going on as these protesters, by the thousands, are chanting, making up lines, chanting it to the police, whose boss is being humiliated by these lines. 3 days after this, January 28th, Habib ElAdly is gone. Now, I don't think it had to do because these kind of poems were being written about him, but the humiliation of the man is related to this kind of cultural production. Let me move over to just a couple images. There's a war for our understanding about what the meaning of the revolution has been. On the left-hand side, a very powerful image from the Battle of Tahrir Bridge from January 28th, in which that's the police water hoses spraying men who are praying, who are prostrating themselves to pray, right? And that was one of the first images to come out on January 28th. That is certainly one aspect, very serious, confrontational, right, battle. There was another aspect to the revolution, and that is more rooted in this expressive culture I'm talking about, which has to do with the emergence of really a festival-like arena in the middle of Tahrir Square. so that the protests were really a celebration. I don't want to say it's one or the other. It was clearly both. But the culture aspect had to do really with, in at least what friends have jokingly called the Republic of Tahrir Square. So for a good couple weeks, the square became a virtual tent city with people staying there around the clock. It was a site of battles. It had its own foreign policy. It became its own country for a few days. And as women have especially noticed, during this time, during these 2 weeks of the occupation of Tahrir Square, sexual harassment went to zero or near zero. This was a place, it was not a fun place to be a woman walking across Tahrir Square beforehand. But during that festival and protest occupation of Tahrir Square, that changed. So women were prominently involved and front and center. Now, I want to end with just to give you some sounds. One is, so that here again is that, do you see the sound speakers there on the right-hand side? And in fact, our colleague and resident poet, Tamim Barghouti, had his own poetry. You read your poetry on Aljazeera. It was broadcast live to people sitting there. So notice that part of this is local and part of it is global, right? And that expressive culture is one of the things that are linking activists here and activists there together. It's a great poem too, so you should ask him to recite it. One of the first things I noticed was that the music of this duo, on the right, that's Sheikh Imam, an Egyptian folk singer, beloved of the Arab left, third world nationalist, really amazing. I'll play you a little something of him in just a second. And a poet on the left there, Ahmed Fouad Negm. This is poetry that has been in the minds of protests, secular leftist protests in Egypt since the 1970s. This emerged in those first few days as a key text. And the text in particular, I want to play for you, is this. It's a song called Humma Ihnamin wa Humma Min. It's lo-fi. This is cassette culture. This is a recording probably from the 70s or 80s. By the time I received it in the 80s, it had been recorded 3 or 4 times. So this is a song. I'm just going to play you a little snippet of it to give you a sense. And this was being sung in Tahrir Square. Listen, it's very straightforward. Them and us and them. They're the sultans and emirs. They wear all the latest fashions while we sleep 7 per room. They eat pigeon and chicken while we eat beans so much they're as sick of us as we are of them. They fly around in their jets while we suffer dying in our crowded buses. Think about it. Try to guess what this song is about. Think harder and take a stab. Who do you think will come out on top? This is Sheikh Imam's voice singing this song. I love this. This is how I learned Arabic. Listening to these cassettes. So that's one soundscape that was coming out as people were just singing these songs that are very well known. Let me give you something a little higher fi than that. Here's a band from a folk music band from Alexandria called Iskandar, and they do a lot of renditions of Sheikh Imam's music and Ahmed Fouad Negm's poetry as well. They showed up on stage. They're from Alexandria. They showed up in Tahrir to play. That's them playing on the stage in Tahrir Square. Activists brought their guitars, their ouds, their drums, and played along. You see this all over the place. Tambura, one of my personal favorite jam bands. They're like the Fish or the Grateful Dead of Egypt. They're from the Mediterranean city of Port Said. They showed up in the second week and did a long jam late at night. They're really interesting. This is not particularly a political band, but they were there and insisting that this revolution had a celebrational aspect to it. Now, I'm going to end with a song by this guy, Rami Assam. That's him on the left. That's an album of his. Sort of a heartthrobby guy, good-looking guy. And he sort of came into his own during the revolution. That's him in the tent city of Tahrir on the right-hand side. And I want to finish with a song, with a clip of him playing. Oops, what did I just do? Did I erase that? No. Okay, Rami Assam playing on that soundstage with the transition. It's a catchy tune. If you were to see the words written on the page, you wouldn't be able to get that this is a celebrational thing, saying down with Hosni Mubarak. Here, you can feel it. This is something to look forward to and to take joy in. And there's that slogan again. All right. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. One challenge I've had as a high school history teacher is talking about these events, what's going on in Tunisia and Egypt, without erasing the extraordinary multiplicity of difference that exists within these societies. And throughout your talk, you've talked about Egyptians, as if there's something coherent about that, as if there's something that holds that together, that category. I'm wondering if there's something going on right now that allows us to talk about Egyptians with a sense of coherence, as if there's something about that that makes sense. Again, trying to communicate this idea to high school students, I think, is key to understanding history. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
It's a great question. I mean, most of us think of nations as constructs. In other words, that these are communities that are actually quite complicated and composed of different communities, some of which are actually in struggle with one another. Egypt is no different. In other words, that Egypt, like any other society, is composed of all sorts of classes and groups with their own interests in pursuing their own aspirations. One of the remarkable things has been that because of, in the revolution, those differences between secularists and the Muslim Brothers, for instance, has moved to the background. They're there. And in the cultural expression, it's been remarkable that this has been a forum for people to talk about what is Egyptian about everybody, superseding or transcending all those other boundaries. For instance, right next to Tahrir Square is the Nubian Writers Association. This is a group that for much of the 90s held events talking about discrimination, racial and ethnic discrimination of Nubians by the Egyptian government and in Egyptian society. And in some ways is a very important dissident intellectual organization organized around racial consciousness among Nubians, whose homeland was erased by Egypt in the building of the Aswan Dam. What did they do? They immediately started funneling Nubian musicians and providing to Tahrir to take part and providing food. And this is true of all the NGOs that I've heard of, all of them were doing this. It became a common mission. One of the striking things about this is that this has resurrected among Egyptians a sense of mission, a sense of a common purpose, something to work for. And so in that sense, in the coming months, that will be the time for the differences to come out and the struggles to reassert themselves. But right now, absolutely, there is a focus. Now, in terms of Tunisia and Libya and so on, these are really, it's true, I would say they're really different histories. Egypt has been more or less Egypt for many, many centuries. There's a cultural and historical coherence to the Nile River Valley that transcends multiple religions and historical epochs. Libya, for instance, just to take the next example, Libya is a construct of the early 20th century. Before the Italian colonization of Libya, that was 3 distinct provinces that, in the east, those are the old Greek colonies of the Punic Greek colonies, the Greek-speaking colonies. In the west, those are the Latin-speaking colonies of Tripoli. And in the south, in the Fezzan, that is not even, that's just a different world. That's Sahara. We have to remember, and so those 3 things were brought together by probably the most incompetent colonial rule of all time, which is the Italian rule of Libya, in which 50% of the Libyan population, 50% died in 30 years. When the Italians went in and invaded, they had no Arabists. They had no Arabists. They destroyed all the civil institutions built up over centuries by the Ottomans and in Berber society and so on. The Italians wrecked that. And so, yeah, the Libyan people have been suffering ever since. But that idea of the Libyan people, that's relatively new. And I think what we're seeing right now, it's not an accident that the uprising has happened in the East. And we will not see, I think it'll be really hard to say that we'll see an emerging Libyan consensus in the coming weeks or days. I think what we'll see is, in fact, a fragmentation, which is reflecting historical realities and a lack of a central state. Egypt is different, too. Egypt has a central state and powerful institutions that get people thinking that they're all Egyptian. Libya has the opposite. They have a radically decentralized state. So the Ministry of Electricity is in Benghazi and the Ministry of Water is in Tripoli. That's because each ministry is given to a different tribe. And the roads are good where the Ministry of the Roads are, in Tripoli, and the electricity is great in Benghazi. That's how so these are really separate countries with separate histories, and it is difficult because each one of them deserves its own study. There's no way around that.
Thank you for this amazing presentation. Where would you put Kulthum in this tradition?
Yeah, great idea. Great. So Kulthum, so there's, in 1952, in January 1952, there's an uprising against the foreign privileges, or the privileges of the foreign elites in Cairo under British rule, and a protest against British rule. That uprising, which results in the burning of foreign-owned properties and businesses and so on, is put down pretty brutally by the British. But it's a really unstable situation, and so when there's a military coup in July 1952, it's popularly accepted. People don't go out in the streets and protest the military coup. They accept it because they're just so sick of what had gone before. And a number of entertainers attached themselves to the coup, not to that protest in January. They attached themselves to the coup of 1952, which is also called the Egyptian Revolution. I mean, Egypt has 3 official revolutions. Not many other countries I know of have 3 official. 1881, 1919, and 1952. All of them are celebrated in metro stations, history books, statues, and all sorts of, and holidays, all of them, right? And so the people who attach themselves to that third one include Kulthum, who lends her support to the Nasser regime at a critical time. She, in the 60s, though, starts to do all sorts of very interesting solidarity work with Palestinians and also with other Arab countries. So after 1967, she goes on a very famous concert tour to raise money for revolution in Palestine and so on. So she's complicated in that history, but I wouldn't say more than that. I don't think she's people are. There is a song by Shadia, another Egyptian singer of that time, of that sort of period, who's I've heard her songs being sung in Tahrir, but I haven't heard anything about Kulthum. That's not to say it hasn't been happening at all. Okay, okay, there you go. Aljazeera. Right, that's Aljazeera.
Yeah.
So what? But I haven't heard any reports of Kulthum being relevant in Tahrir. Right.
But it's generational. It's very generational. Right. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, look, I guess what I would say to this is that Arabs all over the world, when they're thinking about Egypt and they want to just have a sentimental moment thinking about Egypt, they'll put on Kulthum. And just to, it's, you know, I've been listening to Libyan rap music for the last 3 days. Why? Because I want to be thinking about Libya, but I don't want to be watching the news. You know, it's that kind of thing, just to feel it or to feel something good about it. I think Kulthum does that, and it crosses generations. Right?
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Colla, for this presentation. We cannot have Egypt without art, and it's the Hollywood of the Middle East. You know, that's very understanding to see that. And thank you for bringing this to our attention. One thing I would have liked to see also is when the Christians were holding hands, protecting Friday prayers one Friday, and it was on CNN. They showed they were Christians by their hands.
Right.
That was very emotional, as well as some Christian Coptic walking on the street holding the cross and supporting.
Sure.
So it's not only one way. So that was also emotional.
Great. Well, let me respond to that. It's interesting because one of the first things people started saying was, since January 25th, there have been no attacks on Christians in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And so this goes back to that first question about national unity or the sort of a shared project. But it goes deeper than that, to accusations that the Ministry of the Interior and Habib ElAdly was likely behind that the Alexandria bombing in early January. And so these shows of solidarity, and I mean, it comes out in the slogans also. That's the idea that this is Christians and Muslims or all Egyptians together has been a dominant one. But that's part of this is to say that it's not about being Christian or being Muslim. That this is in fact, so we have images of Muslims protecting Christians and vice versa. One thing that's interesting is that until this revolution, one of the dominant revolutionary slogans in Egypt was Egypt for all Egyptians. Masr li kull Masriin. Does anybody know the religion of the person who penned that slogan? His name was Yaqub Sunua. Yaqub Sunua was an Italian Jew who lived in Alexandria and was one of the revolutionaries in 1881. So when he said that, he meant Egypt for Muslims, Christians, and Jews, like him. And over time, that Jewish aspect of Egyptian society since 1881 has vanished. So now when people use that phrase, and they still do once in a while, they mean Muslims and Christians. In other words, but in each of these cases, the idea is to reach beyond and transcend sectarian differences.
One more thing I was going to say also, you mentioned does not cost anything for the people, no money or nothing. But after, now we don't see any banks opening. We have the economy is getting bad. Things is not. It does cost a lot of money as well. I just wanted for you to elaborate after the fact.
No, my point is really simple. It doesn't. So for instance, one of the differences between making a film and writing poetry is it doesn't cost you any money to sit down and write a poem, right? And that's what I meant, is that this culture, revolution looks really different when you look at it from the eyes of a poet. But when you look at it from the eyes of a novelist, right, novelists write after the fact. And the Egyptian novelists who write about revolution tend to be really pessimistic. If you've read Naguib Mahfouz, you may have picked up on the fact that he is pretty pessimistic about the ability of humans to change their nature, right? When he writes about revolution, it's the opposite story. Filmmakers also are going to tell different stories. So that was my point, is that this is a do-it-yourself culture. You know, it's spontaneous. It doesn't rely on heavy investment. And the economy, I'll leave that for other people to speak. Thanks very much, Dana.